Sometimes manufacturers like to keep the best cars they make for their home markets, you know, like a little present to themselves. And few countries do this more often than Japan. Now, these cars can be special edition models you could only buy in Japan, but others are the exact same cars you could buy in the UK, but tuned and tweaked to be a little bit better. So here's my list of where Japan made slightly better versions of the cars it sold us here in the UK. Subaru loves giving its cars really long names, like Subaru Impreza WRX STI Spec C. What's that all about, eh? It's just like they're trying to use up spare Scrabble letters by sticking them on their cars. But seriously, the STI Spec C is a seriously impressive bit of kit. It was based on the second generation Impreza, the blob-eye model for all you Subaru nerds out there, but it was made to feel even more like a proper rally car. The regular WRX STI got a 280 horsepower 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder boxer engine in the UK, but the JDM Spec C got a load of tasty upgrades, and I'm not just talking about mud flaps, fog lights and spoilers. For a start, they revved to 8,000 RPM instead of the usual 7,500 RPM redline, and that helped them make 300 horsepower. On top of that, they also got equal length exhaust headers to help the turbo spool up quicker, which helps reduce turbo lag. Now this means that they don't have the characteristic warble that you get from the UK versions of the Subaru Impreza, but you know what, it doesn't matter. The car just had a bit more performance. Also, Spec C's got a stronger limited slip differential to deal with the extra power and to help give them a bit more traction on gravel. The bodies themselves also had a bit more welding on them to make them stiffer, and that helped improve the handling. No list of special JDM cars would be complete without a Nissan Skyline. Now this has got to be the most famous Japanese car of all time, right? But there's one version that makes the normal GT-R look like your grand's Nissan Micra. It's called the Nismo Z-Tune, and it's what happens when you give one of the fastest Japanese cars ever to Nissan's in-house tuning department, Nismo. They threw away the standard RB26 engine and gave it a 500 horsepower 2.8 litre straight six from Nissan's GT500 race car. They also bolted on new alloy wheels, a more aerodynamic body kit, and loads of carbon fibre. In fact, the bonnet, the wings, drive shafts, and even bits of the floor are made from the stuff. Despite all this, the car still weighed the same as a standard GT-R, which seems a bit odd. However, this was mostly because Nismo had to seriously upgrade the cooling system to stop the engine from destroying itself. Nismo only actually made 20 of the things, so it's not just one of the fastest Skylines ever, it's also the rarest. If you ever find one up for sale, it'll set you back more than £350,000. The Honda NSX is probably one of the best handling cars of all time. After all, Ayrton Senna helped develop it. But in 1992, Honda reckoned they could do even better. So they rolled up their sleeves and built the very first Type R model ever. This NSX Type R is one of the fastest Hondas ever built, partly because it's so light. You see, the regular NSX weighed 1,350 kilos, so it's hardly a poor car, but the Type R managed to lose a whopping 120 kilograms by ditching loads of sound deadening, its air conditioning system, the stereo, and the electric windows. The NSX Type R got a facelift in 2002, which got rid of the pop-up headlights, new bumpers, a rear diffuser, and a wing for extra downforce. Honda claimed the car's 3.2 litre V6 produced 276 horsepower, but that was only to comply with Japanese regulations. It actually made quite a bit more than that. However, as brilliant as it was, the NSX Type R never went on sale outside Japan. The selfish buggers. The Mazda RX-7 is arguably the most successful rotary engine sports car ever. Now, a rotary engine uses burning fuel to spin a set of triangular rotors instead of pushing pistons up and down in a cylinder. These rotors can turn faster than conventional pistons and produce very high power in a really compact package. The RX-7 only had a 1.3 litre turbocharged engine, but it made 239 horsepower. Well, that was in the UK. The same RX-7s in Japan were pumping out 255 horsepower, and they were quite a bit lighter too. Mid-range cars in Japan weighed just 1,230 kilograms, but UK cars weighed 1,325 kilos. It was a bit like they'd been stuck in lockdown for a few months and just been raiding the freezer. Part of the reason was because all UK cars came with an electric sunroof, cruise control, and 2 oil coolers instead of just one as standard. Now, the extra cooling was probably for the best though. You see, rotary engines don't have the best reliability record, and they tend to overheat, especially if you drive them a little bit too quickly for a little bit too long. Japanese car makers aren't just about making mad sports cars for drifting through the mountains. Some brands like Lexus do luxury just as well as the Germans. Now, the new Lexus LS is just about as opulent as it gets. That interior is amazing. And even when you go back a few decades, some Japanese cars had the poshest, most high-tech cars on the road. Take the Lexus LS 400 for example. It might be 25 years old now, but it came with computer-controlled air suspension like in a brand new Mercedes S-Class. Now if that's not enough, it even had some extra suspension in the seats to make things even more comfortable. If you wanted all the bells and whistles though, you had to buy a Japanese version. Now these were actually called Toyota Celsiors instead of Lexus LS 400s. They looked the same and had the same engines, but they came with more paint choices, reclining rear seats, and one of the first onboard satellite navigation systems in the world. They even had laser-guided cruise control that would measure the distance to other cars and slow down or speed up to keep a safe gap. That was seriously high-tech back in the 90s. The 350Z is Nissan's take on the old-school style sports car. Now there aren't any fancy electronics here. It has a 3.5 litre naturally aspirated V6 engine, a manual gearbox and rear-wheel drive. This made it a really good drift car, but Nissan wanted people to do more than just copy their favourite scene from Tokyo Drift. So they got their Nismo tuning division to cook up a properly sorted track day version. This was called the 350Z Nismo S-Tune GT. The first thing they did was crank up the power to 300 horsepower instead of the usual 280 horsepower, thanks to a remap and a higher 7,200 RPM redline. Then they fitted stiffer, load suspension and a set of new alloy wheels. Finally, they bolted on a new spoiler and a more aerodynamic body kit. This last bit was actually pinched off another JDM special edition called the Type E. Just so you know, one S-Tune GT did make its way to the UK, but only because it was imported by Nissan for its own heritage collection. So it probably won't be going on sale anytime soon. If you want the fastest hot hatchback ever, you buy something like the four-wheel drive AMG A45S. But if you want to have some leery front-wheel drive fun, you buy a Civic Type R instead. The Civic Type R has always been one of the best cars for smiles per mile. I mean, it's utterly mega. But Japanese versions of the EP3 model were even better at making you grin than the ones we got in the UK. This is because they came with loads of engine upgrades. They got new manifolds, high compression pistons, new camshafts, a new flywheel, and a remapped ECU. This meant they made 215 horsepower instead of the 200 horsepower you got in the UK cars. And Honda, they didn't stop there. Japanese cars also got helical limited slip differentials and bright red bucket seats, just to rub salt into the wound. The craziest thing though is that all EP3 Civic Type Rs were made in Swindon in the UK. Honda just decided to ship all the best versions back to Japan to keep them for themselves. The Subaru Impreza and Mitsubishi Evo are kind of like Laurel and Hardy. You couldn't have one without the other. But while Subaru's been making fast estate versions of the Impreza for years, Mitsubishi only made one Evo estate. Now this was back in 2005 when Mitsubishi was making the bonkers Evo IX. It was the last curvy one before they got all square and angry looking. Unlike the saloon version, the Evo IX Wagon only went on sale in Japan. The engine was the same as a saloon, so it got a 2-litre 4-cylinder turbo with 291 horsepower, and you could get a 6-speed manual or a 5-speed automatic. All manual Evo IX wagons came in sportier MR specification. That means Mitsubishi Racing, in case you didn't know already. They also got a front splitter, 17-inch BBS alloy wheels and lowered Bilstein suspension as standard. All in all, the wagon was only 20 kilograms heavier than the saloon, and that was mostly because of the extra glass around the back end. The Evo wagon also had folding seats and, for some extra crash protection, bars in the back doors. In total, Mitsubishi only made 2,500 Evo IX wagons, and they kept them all for Japan, which is a bit selfish really. The Honda S2000 is sort of like Honda's version of a Mazda MX-5, just more powerful. It's a small, lightweight convertible with a naturally aspirated engine in the front, a manual gearbox and rear-wheel drive. It came out in 1999 and was a massive success. Its aluminium X-frame chassis meant it was super stiff, and its 240 horsepower 2.2 litre engine revved to a mental 8,500 RPM redline. Well, that was in the UK. JDM versions actually produced 250 horsepower. But that's not all. In 2008, Honda launched the S2000 Type S. Now this was based on a stripped out track day version called the S2000 Club Racer. It got new alloy wheels Alcantara interior bits, and a new aluminium gear knob with a shorter throw and a springier linkage to make it feel meatier to use. Honda also gave the car stiffer suspension and a new body kit that actually produced a little less lift than the standard S2000. Honda only made 1,755 Type S's, and yes, you guessed it, they were all sold in Japan. Petrol heads love Mazda MX-5. They're cheap, they look good, they're brilliant to drive, and they're very easy to modify. In fact, I even bolted on a supercharger to my NB MX-5 to see if I could make it faster than a Porsche Boxster. And it sort of was in a straight line, not so much around the corners. Anyway, like so many Japanese cars, the ones we've got in the UK were a little bit different, especially the first generation NA models of the MX-5. In fact, they weren't even called MX-5 or Mazdas in Japan. They had an UNOS badge instead of a Mazda one and were named Roadster. They also tended to have more equipment like air conditioning as standard, more interior trim colours, nicer leather and speakers in the head restraints of the seats so you could hear the music better with the roof down. More importantly, they often came spec'd with a limited slip differential for better traction at corners. Now on the downside, the Japanese MX-5s were limited to 112 miles an hour, but they had a higher redline than the early UK cars, so they could rev to 7,250 RPM instead of the 6,500 RPM that we got in the UK. And revving out a naturally aspirated engine is all part of the fun now, isn't it? You could also get the JDM cars with an automatic gearbox, which was never actually offered in the UK. Although that's a good thing, because really the only point of having an MX-5 with an automatic gearbox is if you've only got one leg. Now before I finish off the video, I'd just like to explain to you that there are a few cars that actually got better when they were sold outside of Japan. And one of them is the Toyota Supra Mark IV. Now back in the 90s, you couldn't build and sell a car in Japan with more than 276 horsepower. So JDM Supras produced, you guessed it, exactly 276 horsepower. But the cars Toyota exported had different turbos and bigger fuel injectors, so they made more power. American Supers, for instance, produced 325 horsepower as standard, but the ones in Europe, where the emission rules are different, made 330 horsepower. So that's 54 more horsepower than the JDM cars. So there, goes to show that Japanese car makers don't always keep the best stuff for themselves. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a like. Also, let me know of other cases where Japan kept the best cars for itself in the comments below. I'd like to check those out. If you want to watch more videos, they're in the windows below. And if you click over somewhere, you can go to carwow to download the latest carwow app. It's completely free and you can do things like compare offers on cars, see our reviews, and use a special number plate scanner to scan the number plate of a car using your phone's camera, and it'll tell you how much that car is worth. Download it, it's completely free.